Somewhere in your house right now, there is probably a bag of plant food with a little scoop tucked inside it. And for most of our gardening lives, that scoop has felt like love, like the thing a good gardener does for a plant that is struggling. I want to tell you something that took me an embarrassingly long time to learn. With the plants I am about to show you, that scoop is often the very thing doing the harm. These are not the soft annuals the garden center wheels out by the flat every spring, the ones bred to look perfect on the shelf and then give out by August. These are comeback plants. Perennials shaped over thousands of years, to live on thin, hungry ground, and to return to your containers year after year, stronger each time, while you do less and less. The whole trick of growing them in a pot comes down to one idea most of us were taught to ignore. You are not really feeding the plant at all. You are tending the few inches of living soil underneath it, and then, more often than you would think, getting out of its way. Here is the part nobody at the register explains. A plant bred for a nursery display and a plant built by nature to survive on its own are two completely different animals. And the difference is mostly in how they treat the soil. Dr. Linda Chalker Scott, the urban horticulturist at Washington State University, who has spent years holding common garden advice up against the actual evidence, keeps returning to the same unglamorous truth. Most of our plant troubles begin and end in the soil, not in another bottle of feed. The tough perennials on this list evolved on prairies and dry, rocky slopes, where the ground was lean and the rain was stingy. Pour rich soil and constant fertilizer on them, and they do exactly what you would do at an all-you-can-eat table. They go soft, floppy, leafy, and short-lived. Keep them a little hungry, and they stand tall for decades. And there is a reason you have never seen that printed on a glossy tag. You cannot bottle the words, "Leave it alone." You cannot patent lean soil. You certainly cannot sell a gardener a fresh flat of it every April. Nobody hid this from you. The market simply never had a reason to keep reminding you. So I am going to walk you through 15 of these plants, grouped by what they ask of you. And keep an eye out, because one of them is a shade plant most folks walk right past. It can turn the darkest, most forgotten corner of a porch into the prettiest spot you own. We will get to it. Let us start with the plant I hear the most heartbreak about, lavender. Somebody always tells me, I have tried lavender 3 times, and it always dies on me. And I always ask the same gentle question. Was it in the ground or in a pot? Because in a heavy garden bed, especially anywhere the summers turn humid, lavender slowly suffocates. The base goes woody, the center dies out, and by the second year it looks ragged and you pull it. But the very same plant, in a clay pot with sharp drainage, behaves like it has finally come home. Lavender was born on the dry, rocky hills of the Mediterranean, and a pot lets you hand it exactly that. The variety to look for is Munstead. It stays compact, around 12 to 18 inches, and it carries a little more cold hardiness than most, which matters up into zones 5 and 6. An unglazed terracotta pot is your friend here, because the clay actually breathes and lets extra moisture escape through its walls. And here is the single most important thing I can tell you. Do not water it on a schedule. No watering every Tuesday and Friday. That habit is what kills it. Let the soil go bone dry, then water deeply, then let it go dry again. That dry, soak, dry rhythm is the one it spent 10,000 years learning. Now, you will hear that a lavender plant keeps the mosquitoes off your porch. I would love for that to be true. The honest version is this. The oils in the leaves do carry a real scent that insects dislike, and crushing a sprig between your fingers on a summer evening is a small pleasure. But a plant sitting quietly in a pot is not going to clear the yard. Grow it for the fragrance, for the bees, and for the fact that deer and rabbits tend to leave it be. That is reward enough. Next is one most folks have never grown, and once they do, they never stop. Agastache, sometimes sold as hummingbird mint. Brush against it and the leaves give off a soft mix of mint and licorice, and from early summer, right up to the first hard frost, the slender flower spikes are busy with bumblebees and hummingbirds from morning until dusk. The variety called Blue Fortune is the workhorse. Lavender blue spikes, about 2 to 3 feet tall, hardy from zones 5 through 9. But here is the thing the tag rarely tells you, and it ties right back to where we started. Agastache does not die of cold nearly as often as it dies of wet feet in winter. In a heavy, soggy garden bed, the crown sits in cold water for months and simply rots. A pot with good drainage holes solves that completely. You give it the sharp, fast-draining home it was built for, and it comes back faithfully. Keep the soil lean, and go very easy on the fertilizer. Feed it too well and you will get a tall, floppy plant with fewer flowers. And flowers are the entire point. It is the same lesson as the lavender, just a different plant saying it. A little hunger, and it thrives. Deer and rabbits, by the way, tend to walk right past it. Now let us talk about a plant that practically dares you to ignore it. Sedum, the variety called autumn joy. It is a succulent, which means it stores its own water right in those thick, fleshy leaves. So it does not want frequent watering, it does not want rich soil, and it certainly does not want feeding. What it wants is sun, decent drainage, and to be left alone. And in return, one pot gives you 4 full seasons. Tight blue-green buds in spring, like little heads of broccoli. Flat flower clusters that open dusty pink in late summer and deepen to brick red in the fall. And then, through winter, the dried seed heads hold their shape and catch the snow when everything else has gone to sleep. Here is the one warning worth remembering. Do not reach for the high nitrogen feed. Overfeed this plant and it grows weak and sappy, and those heavy heads flop right over and snap under their own weight. Keep it lean, and it stands proud for years. After 3 or 4 seasons, you might notice the middle of the clump dying out, leaving a sort of bare ring. Gardeners call it the donut. That is not failure, that is just the plant asking to be split. In early spring, lift it, throw away the tired center, and replant the strong outer pieces. Free plants, from a plant that asked you for almost nothing. If you are someone who forgets to water, or you travel, or some weeks just get away from you, this is your plant. Hens and chicks, the ones nurseries label Semper Vivum. They form tight, geometric rosettes that honestly look like little carved jewels, in silver blue, deep wine red, and bright green. They store so much water in those fleshy leaves that they can shrug off weeks of complete drought. And I will say this plainly, because it is the opposite of everything we were taught. The fastest way to kill them is kindness, overwatering. Give them a shallow pot, mix the soil about half and half with grit or perlite, set them in the sun, and then mostly forget they exist. There is one moment that worries new growers. Every so often, one rosette will send up a strange tall stalk, flower, and then die. Do not panic. That is simply its natural life. And long before it goes, it has already pushed out a ring of little offsets, the chicks, that fill the gap and keep the colony going for years. Pluck out the spent center and let the family carry on. Here is one for cheerful color that runs from early summer all the way to frost. Threadleaf coreopsis, the kind sold as moonbeam or Zagreb. The foliage is fine and ferny, almost like green thread, and it handles the fast-drying conditions of a pot beautifully. But the gift of this plant is one word: self-cleaning. The old blooms simply drop and new ones take their place, which means no deadheading. You do not have to stand over it pinching off spent flowers to keep it going. It does that quiet work itself. One thing only: skip the slow-release fertilizer granules, feed it heavily, and you will get a lush mound of green leaves and hardly any of those little yellow daisies. And the daisies are why we grew it. A lean, fast-draining mix is all it asks. Are you noticing the pattern yet? Nearly every plant on this list is telling us the same thing, in its own way. Yarrow is another that asks for very little, once it is settled in. Its foliage is soft, gray-green and ferny, pretty even when it is not blooming, and it throws up flat-topped flower clusters in warm reds, soft golds, and dusty pinks. Now here is an honest caution that the word drought-tolerant tends to hide. A plant is only drought-tolerant after its roots have filled the pot. That first season, you do need to water it steadily while it establishes. Skip that, and you will lose it before it ever gets tough. Once it is rooted in, though, you can very nearly forget it. Divide it every 2 or 3 years to keep those rich named colors strong. Left alone too long, yarrow has a way of drifting back toward plain white. A few minutes with a spade each couple of years, and it stays vivid. Every good pot needs something standing tall in the middle, and this is mine. Perennial salvia, the variety caradonna. Mind you, this is the true perennial, not the soft annual salvia sold in six-packs every May. The stems are stiff and nearly black, and the violet-blue flower spikes rise straight up off them and simply refuse to flop, even on a deck that catches the afternoon wind. It blooms first in late spring, and then, if you give the faded spikes a clean cut back down to where you can see fresh growth low on the plant, it rewards you with a second, full flush in late summer. That little haircut, maybe 10 minutes for the whole pot, is the only real work it asks of you all season. And once more, the same rule. Keep it lean, feed it heavily, and those proud, stiff stems go soft and leggy and start to lean. Give it full sun, hungry soil, and a single trim, and Caradonna will stand at attention from spring into September. Now the prairie plants, the ones that feed the birds straight through winter. First, the purple coneflower, and the variety I reach for in pots is Magnus, named Perennial Plant of the Year back in 1998. If you have fought with coneflowers in a garden bed, I understand. Down in the ground they are battling tree roots, clay, and crowding. In a pot, you hand them the lean, well-drained prairie soil they were born for. Give it a deep container, at least 14 to 16 inches, so that long root system has room. And here, even with a tough native, the lean rule holds. Pour on the fertilizer in a pot, and you invite crown and root rot, rather than more flowers. Then, when fall comes, here is the kindest thing you can do. Nothing. Leave the spent flowers standing. Those spiky brown seed heads turn beautiful under frost, and all winter long the goldfinches will come and work them for seed, right outside your window. Hardy from zones 3 through 9, which covers very nearly everyone listening. A pot of coneflower is half garden, half bird feeder, and it costs you a single season of not tidying up. Right beside that coneflower, plant its partner. The black-eyed Susan, the variety Goldsturm, which took the very same Plant of the Year honor 1 year later, in 1999. Deep golden petals around a dark chocolate eye, and the two of them together, gold and purple, look like something a designer charged a fortune to arrange. It grows tidy and upright, stiff enough that it never needs staking, and like the coneflower, you leave the seed heads standing for the winter birds. One honest note on care. In a hot, humid spell, you may see some dark spotting creep up the lower leaves by late summer. That is a cosmetic leaf spot, and I want to be clear. Do not go dousing the plant in harsh chemical fungicide over it. It does not threaten the plant, and it will not stop it coming back next year. The simple fix is to water at the soil, down at the base, instead of wetting the leaves from above. Good airflow and a dry leaf. That is the whole remedy, and it costs nothing. If you want a plant that simply will not quit, it is the daylily called Stella d'Oro. Daylilies carry fleshy, water-storing roots that handle the dry swings of a container far better than fine-rooted plants ever could. Stella was bred to stay compact, about 12 inches, and to rebloom in waves of warm gold from early summer clear into fall. Give it full sun, lean soil, steady water that first season, and then treat it the way you treat the coneflower. Let it dry, water deep, let it dry again. It is about as close to bulletproof as a flowering plant gets. But I have to stop here and give you a serious word, because I would never forgive myself if I skipped it. If you share your home or your patio with a cat, please listen closely. Daylilies are gravely toxic to cats, not a mild stomachache. Every part of the plant, the leaves, the flowers, even the pollen, can cause sudden kidney failure, and it can happen from a very small amount. The Poison Control Centers and the FDA are united and firm on this. Curiously, it does this only to cats. A dog may get an upset stomach, but not the kidney damage. So if there is any chance a curious cat could reach this pot, set it somewhere they truly cannot get to, or simply choose another plant from this list and carry no worry at all. A beautiful flower is never worth a frightening trip to the vet. By now, you might have guessed the real secret of this whole video is not any one of these plants. It is the few inches of soil they all sit in. So let me hand you the part that actually saves you the most money. For most of these comeback perennials, I want a lean, living mix. Something like 2 parts finished compost, 1 part coconut coir to hold a little moisture without packing down, and 1 part perlite or pumice so the water runs through fast instead of pooling around the roots. For the truly dry-loving ones, the lavender, the agastache, the sedum, I lean it even further. almost half perlite, because I want that water gone quickly. Now here is the habit worth breaking. You do not need to dump that soil out and buy fresh bags every spring. That is an expensive ritual nobody questions. Old potting mix has lost some structure, and most of its nutrients, but the bones of it are still good. Each spring, for the pots that still hold a sleeping perennial, just scrape away the top 2 or 3 inches, gently, not deep enough to disturb roots, and lay in a fresh layer of compost with a generous handful of worm castings worked in. Those castings matter because they carry the living microbes back into the soil, the ones that quietly turn organic matter into food the roots can use. You are not feeding the plant, you are rebuilding the living engine underneath it. And that, right there, is the thing the industry cannot bottle. A scoop of your own compost and a handful of castings costs almost nothing, which, in a business built on the next bag, is the one thing it is never allowed to be. I have taken everything we are covering, the lean soil recipe, the short list of which plants want a haircut and which want to be left entirely alone, and an honest year 1 to year 3 of what to expect, and gathered it onto a single page you can tape inside the shed door or tuck in a kitchen drawer. If the code is on your screen, point your phone at it and the page is yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for, no catch. Then stay with me, because the next group solves the problem almost everyone gives up on, that dark, shady corner where nothing seems to want to grow, including the one plant I promised you at the very start. Let us step into the shade, where most folks think the fun ends. It does not. Start with coral bells, heuchera, and growing this one for its flowers would be a mistake. You grow it for the leaves. They come in deep wine burgundy, warm caramel, glowing lime, and a near black that catches the light with a faint shine, and that color holds from the moment it wakes in spring until it sleeps in fall, far longer than any bloom. In a mixed pot, it is the anchor, the color you build everything else around. And there is a quiet bonus. That low, dense mound of leaves blankets the soil surface so completely that weed seeds never get the light to sprout. The plant does your weeding for you. One thing that startles new growers. In cold country, the freeze and thaw of winter can actually heave the whole crown up out of the soil, lifting those shallow roots into the air. That is completely normal, and it is not something you did wrong. Come early spring, just press the crown gently back down, or top the pot with a little fresh soil to cover the roots. 5 seconds, and it rewards you with another full year of color. And here is the plant I promised you at the start, the one most people walk straight past. Hosta, the variety called Patriot. If you grow hostas in the ground, you already know their heartbreak. Slugs turn those broad leaves into lace by July, and most folks answer with slug bait that can harm the birds, the dogs, and the good beetles too. But lift a hosta up into a pot, even a little off the ground, and you have quietly solved the biggest problem. The slugs simply have a much harder time reaching it, no poison required. You will hear that a ring of copper tape around the rim stops them cold. I will be straight with you, the way this channel always tries to be. When the Royal Horticultural Society actually tested copper tape in a real garden, alongside eggshells and grit, they found it did not meaningfully reduce the damage. So lean on the things that do work. Height, a tidy pot with no slug hideouts nearby, and picking off the few stragglers by hand of an evening. Now, Patriot earns its place for the white. Its deep green leaves are edged in clean, bright white, and in a dark corner that edge works like a little mirror, throwing light around and lifting the whole space. Those thick, overlapping leaves even shade the soil like a living mulch, so you water far less than you would think. Hardy from zones 3 through 8. One pot will come back for 20 or 30 years, and every few springs you can split it and have free plants for the whole street. Here is the plant I point people to when they have got the pot from another planet. The one in the spot where nothing should grow. Lily turf, which the nurseries call liriope. It gives you dense tufts of dark, strap-like leaves that stay green in most climates, sends up little lavender spikes in late summer, and follows them with shiny black berries. Sun, shade, damp soil, dry soil. It just quietly performs. But this one comes with a small, important homework assignment at the nursery. Check the botanical tag and make sure you are buying Liriope muscari, the clumping kind that stays politely where you put it. What you want to avoid is Liriope spicata, the running kind, which spreads by underground rhizomes and has earned a place on invasive lists across a good part of the country. Same common name, very different manners. Buy the clumping muscari, and you get all the toughness with none of the regret. Now to soften the edges, catmint, the variety called Walker's Low, and do not let the name fool you. It is named for a place, not for its height. It spills out in a soft cloud of lavender blue from late spring through summer, and it asks for exactly one job a year. After that first big flush fades, take your shears and give the whole thing a haircut, cutting it back by about half. That single trim triggers a second wave of bloom that carries on into fall. The aromatic foliage means deer and rabbits generally leave it alone. The one creature it does not repel is the neighborhood cat, who may decide a young plant is the finest bed in town and flatten it. If that is a risk on your street, just set a little wire cage over the pot for the first season until the roots take hold. After that, it is tough enough to take the affection. And to finish, the plant that makes a container look like a professional designed it. The perennial that finally replaces all those throwaway annual trailers. Hardy geranium, the variety called Roseanne. The flowers are a luminous violet blue with a pale eye, and they pour over the rim of a pot from late spring until the first hard frost, with no deadheading at all. There is a lovely bit of plant biology behind that, and it is worth knowing because it explains why she asks so little of you. Roseanne is a sterile hybrid. She cannot set seed, so every time a flower fades, the plant does not pour its energy into making seed the way most plants do. It just rolls that energy straight back into more flowers. An unbroken loop of bloom that needs nothing from you to keep going. And because she is sterile, she also stays put in a tidy clump rather than running off into the yard. Hardy from zones 5 through 8, a touch lower with some winter cover. Go easy on the nitrogen, same story as all the rest. Too much feed buys you leaves instead of flowers. And if she gets a little leggy in midsummer heat, a simple haircut brings her right back. One plant, cascading violet blue, from spring to frost, asking almost nothing. Before we close, let me do the thing this channel believes in most. Tell you what does not work, even when it is popular. Because being honest about that is exactly what keeps the rest worth trusting. The biggest myth is not a product at all. It is the reflex we started with, that a struggling plant needs feeding. For these lean-loving perennials, the feed is usually the problem, not the cure. And then there are the kitchen remedies that travel around the internet every spring. Dr. Jeff Gilman, a horticulturist who wrote an entire book weighing these garden remedies against the evidence, and Dr. Chalker Scott at Washington State, both land in the same honest place. Crushed eggshells will not give your pot a quick hit of calcium. They break down far too slowly for that. A buried banana peel is not the potassium bomb the headlines promise, and whole peels can draw pests. And used coffee grounds, for all the talk, sit close to neutral once they have been brewed. They will not turn your soil acidic for the blueberries. None of these will wreck your garden. Toss the eggshells and the grounds in the compost, and they do quiet good over time. But they are not magic. And the truth is the more freeing answer. Lean soil, a little living compost, and the right plant in the right pot will outperform every kitchen trick on the internet and cost you less. I want to leave you with something I had to learn the slow way. For years, I treated every struggling plant as a plant that needed more from me. More water, more feed, more fussing. The bag in the shed felt like the answer to everything. It took me a long time, and more than a few lost plants, to understand that the best thing I could offer most of them was a handful of living soil and the patience to step back. The gardeners I learned the most from were never the ones rushing out with a bottle. They were the ones who built good ground once, set the right plant into it, and then sat down. My grandmother kept a row of these tough old perennials in mismatched pots by her back step. Coneflower, sedum, a lavender she never once babied, and they came back for her every single year, long after she had stopped being able to kneel in a garden bed. She was not feeding those plants. She was feeding the soil, the way her own mother had taught her. And the soil never once let her down. If that is the kind of gardening you come from, or the kind you would like to grow into, then you already belong here. You have spent enough summers on your knees to a schedule that never quite fit your life. You have earned a porch full of pots that come back on their own, and an evening to just sit and look at them. If that sounds good to you, subscribe, and let us keep tending the old, honest way, together. I will see you out by the pots.